This video is sponsored by Alpha Draft, where you can play fantasy sports such as CSGO. You can play all different types of tournaments. They have a number of different online leagues, offline events. You have an overall salary, $50,000. You make your team from it. The tournament costs a different amount to enter, and then there's a prize pool. Prize pools are all different kinds. Some are free to enter, some cost a little bit of money, some cost a lot of money. Sometimes you can win thousands, sometimes you can win hundreds, sometimes you can win $50, whatever it might be. People win tens of thousands of dollars every week, every month. Hundreds of thousands, millions given away. Check out the link in the description box below if you'd like to do so. Now, Zonic is one of the greatest players in the history of CS 1.6. In fact, amongst Danish players, he'd quite easily probably in most people's top 5 Danish players to ever play. In the Danes, there was a lot of great Danish players. Some people I've even heard have him as their number 1 player. Personally, I wouldn't. There's a few I'd have ahead of him, I think a grader, but definitely an outstanding player. Absolutely one of the most decorated, and might be the most decorated Danish player in history when you sum everything up, and more importantly, part of one of the greatest lineups of all time. Part of a few lineups that are all-time great lineups, but one in particular that can contend for the title of best team of all time in Counter-Strike, which is the mTw Danish team of 2008 to early 2009. That particular 5-man lineup really you can make a case for how they're the greatest team, along with the Fnatic 2009, SK 2003, Na'Vi 2010, the Polish teams. They can all have a different case made for them, but this one certainly can be, mostly because they dominated. They won 4 or 5 events, 4 during 2008, 5 if you add in the first part of 2009. They won 5 big events with a lineup that was not considered superstar players by any means. They didn't have the best player in the world at any point in time, but in an era which was the most competitive. For me, that was the most competitive year, where the top 4 or 5 teams were insanely good, all winning events. Then the dark horses, there was like 3 or 4 that could win smaller events and could cause massive upsets. And to win 4 or 5 events during this span of about, like a year or so, is just incredible that they were able to do so. And they had an incredible win rate of like 75% plus win rate on maps over that year, with a massive amount played as well. So who is Zonic in terms of his career? Now, I've noticed when I do these career breakdowns, for some of the lesser players, it makes sense when they didn't have that many great accomplishments to list all the big tournaments they played in, key matches and stuff. For these players, like the all-time greats, the real like stellar names of the game, sometimes it doesn't always make sense, I've realised, to go too in-depth on some of the specific tournaments, in as much as if it's part of a great run of a team, I'm probably going to talk about that lineup again with another player, or I should probably do an article or a video about that specific lineup. So I'll probably do something on mTw.dk in the future. So I'll start out, though, with his history. So Zonic first appeared on the top level of the scene around 2005. He was playing a team called Evermore with a player called HPX, who would years later become his teammate in NOA. And this Evermore team was like a decent team within Denmark. They were one of the better teams. And then what happened was he got into this SK Gaming lineup, which was a Danish lineup. People forget this. At the end of 2004, SK Sweden left, became NIP. And so initially, before SK got the Swedish players that would win the back-to-back CPLs that year, which was some of the guys from the SNP lineup when they decided to come back to SK without Heaton and Potty. Before that, they actually picked up a Danish team. And so this Danish team they had, which Zonic then joined for ESWC, was Drali, SPX, Sphinxy is his former name, Egene and Wimp. Now what's interesting is those 4 names I've just mentioned there were all former members of the Titans, which had been one of the best teams of 2004 and was the Danish team that had finished second at World Cyber Games, had won ESWC. Admittedly, they'd won ESWC and finished second at World Cyber Games without SPX in the lineup. They had a different player at the time. Iraz was his name. And so SPX was their 6th man, but this was an incredibly skilled lineup. And so already Zonic's getting put in there with some amazing players, some of whom were the reigning champions of ESWC from the year before. And they managed to make it at the ESWC was one of the majors of the year. They managed to make it 2nd place there, and they lost in the final on Dust 2 to Complexity, which is Fraud and Sunman and Warden and those guys who were at their apex. That was the best they ever were, and they really were the best team in the world. So it was no shame to lose it, and this is a huge, big result early on in Zonic's career. When he goes back to Denmark, a few months later, he starts playing with a lineup called Asylum, which was HPX again. It was MG, and MG's another player who'd be a long-time teammate of his years to come, but also Bloody and Galahad, who were both like decent players and on the top tier, but not world beaters. And the key thing about this lineup was they managed to qualify for season 3 of the World Esports Games, WEG, which are tournaments which for this season and the two before took place in South Korea. You went to South Korea, you lived there for like a month, a few weeks, you played games that were broadcast on TV online, and it was a totally different format to like a LAN that takes 2 to 3 days. When they went to that tournament, despite qualifying, unfortunately, they didn't manage to make the top 4. They didn't manage to make a big impact on the tournament. Not a lot of Western teams did. It was very difficult to. Now, in 2006, the year starts with zonic in a brand new lineup. He's in NOA. And at this point in time, it's a really weird lineup because NOA, the one that had been to WEG, etc., had been a mixture of like Norwegians and Swedish players, and Executor, the legendary Norwegian in-game leader and former star of 1.6, was still the in-game leader. So he'd made this weird hybrid lineup for 2006 that was Norwegian players and Danish players. So it was Zonic and HPX from the Danes, and then there was Executor, PRB, and Zion were all Norwegian players. And PRB and Zion had been in the Team 9 lineup that had come up at the end of 2005 with their star Real, but they didn't have Real now. He'd split off and gone to Catch Gamer. So this lineup was very confused, and everyone was like, is this really going to work? I mean, in theory, Norwegians and Danes can share some language and understand each other, like the languages have some similarities. Well, it did actually, because at the first tournament they went to, SHG Open, which was a LAN that was in Denmark, they won the tournament and they beat Fnatic in the final. Admittedly, Fnatic, you have to realise, yes, was like Khan, Forest, DSM, but this was one of the first big LANs Fnatic had actually ever played out with that new lineup, because they'd only made that lineup at the beginning of 2006. Then they go to other tournaments. They made it to the Euro Cup, lost in the final to Mouse Sports there, who I think had Element at the time. As a result, they played in the Transatlantic Showdown, they played against Team 3D, and they lost there as well, actually. So they finished 4th overall. Let me think, actually. That was after this NOA lineup had actually had some... Let me think. Actually, maybe I'm misremembering that. Maybe he was playing as a stand-in for SOA then. I'm not sure on that one, I forget that. But the problem is, for the rest of the year, there wasn't good results with this lineup. It was a very flawed lineup. That went to WEG Masters, which is this huge tournament with $70,000 first place. Didn't finish top four there. They went to WSVG ISC, which was formerly like the CPL summer event, but taken over the WSVG because that was a tournament circuit that existed 2006, 2007. And they did really poorly here. They didn't even make top 8 here. And this was like a good field, but not an amazing field. To not even finish top 8 was absolutely shockingly bad. And then they made this all-Danish lineup of NOA, and they brought in Ave, who would be a long-time partner of Zonic's going forwards, MG, who'd been his former teammate back in Asylum, HPX, former teammate in Asylum and Evermore, and they brought in Paddy, who was like a decent player, but he's the one who would very quickly be forgotten about, and he's the guy who had to move up for them to become better. At this Euro Cup that they went to, Euro Cup 8, Euro Cup 13 actually rather, it was a very weak field of like not that many good teams, and they won it fairly easily. At the WCG for that year, they finished 4th place, missing out on a medal because they played the Poles in the semi-final, and the Poles were one of the shocking teams that had just risen up at this point in time to become one of the best in the world. That was one of the tournaments that they won in amazing fashion. Lost to them in the semis, and then the bronze medal game, they lost a medal to Hurai, which was the Finnish team led by Lurpis with guys like Ruit and Conte and Nasu. So actually that's when Lurpis won a bronze medal at WCG, one of the majors of the CS 1.6. In 2007, now things start to improve. So you've seen before that, realistically, this lineup of NOA that's all Danes, it's more like a sort of fourth to fifth tight level team. They're not really going to contend for a title. 2007 is when that starts to change. So the year starts off early on. They're finishing like 3rd place at SHG Open this time behind some really good teams. They finished 3rd place at the NLG Season 2, which was behind Fnatic, really good team at this point in time. 69 and 28E, which is Lopez's team, who actually won that event. That was the equivalent of winning like a super stacked Star Ladder final. Lopez actually won it, for all you scrubs who don't know shit about his 1.6 career and think he was a bad player. Certainly wasn't. And then you could see that they still had some issues though, because they even had like a LAN in Denmark, a slap LAN, which was one of the biggest LANs there, that they lost to a mix that was like Gux, who would later on become a great player like 2 years later, and some random scrubbers from like semi-pro Swedish scene. So they had their issues, but then they got Sunder into the lineup. They got rid of Paddy and they got Sunder in, and he was a player where initially he was coming in as a rifler, and they made it to the final of ESWC. So remember 2 years earlier, that was when SK.dk had made it there with Zonic. This time they make it to the final of ESWC. The problem is, in the final, they have to play against Pentagram. And this is where Neo takes over the game. Pentagram win, despite the fact the whole crowd was cheering, like, air away, air away. So they had the whole crowd against them, but the Poles win that final. But they made it to a big final. They then go back and they play another Eurocup final. This time the field's also weak again. They win this one quite easily, so they haven't proved much there. But then another major of the year, the third of that year, was WCG. And at WCG, the bracket starts to play out in such a fucked up way. So the best team in the world's Fnatic. They go out in the group stage. Then the Poles go out relatively early. I think they were beaten by possibly 69N actually. And then 69N, the Finnish team, who was one of the top teams as well, and who'd been the best team in the world early in the year, they go out in a shocking upset to Amazing Gaming, which was Starix and a bunch of Ukrainians like Blade, who at the time had never accomplished anything major in CS whatsoever, but now they made a top 4 of a major. So this NOA team gets to play against Amazing Gaming in the semi-finals. So obviously easy win there. It's not actually as easy as it was, but they did win. They go to the final. And then in the final, they're amazingly playing France. They're playing a team called Emulate, who'd never had any big results beyond like one like top 3 Game Goon event beforehand. And in theory, the way's clear. You've got rid of the Poles, you've got rid of the Swedes, you've got rid of the Finns. You're supposed to be able to win this event now. This gold medal should be yours. But actually, they get shockingly upset because Emulate gets mega carried by this guy called MSX, who had one of the sickest hard carry single-man performances, like full-on Ken Yes early 2015 style wrecking, and he just wins the whole final. So they actually are forced to get another second at a major. And you can see that there's something about the lineup. Something isn't quite right where they're not quite ready to win majors yet. Now, what's interesting is the year ended at DreamHack Winter with them coming 4th and using Wimp as a stand-in instead of Ave. Ave was the in-game leader, so it was understood that Wimp standing in wouldn't make them a better team. But Wimp was, at that time, the greatest Danish player in history. He'd been a phenom as like a 16-year-old, winning SWC. He'd been with Zonic in SK.dk, but then he'd had a few years off where he'd played in like lesser teams. He didn't seem to take the game as seriously. But now you could see he was on the cards to potentially come into this NOA team. So the team becomes mTw, that's the organization they are going to, formerly a German organization, but now they're mTw.dk, and they pick up Wimp. But actually, here's what's interesting. Initially, they did quite badly. They got mega upset by this crazy Greek team called Vatos Locos at the Samsung European Championship, where this guy who you've never heard of before and you'll never hear of again, called Avil, went absolutely hammered, like 30 plus kills. They get upset, and then they got knocked out by alternates. So they didn't even finish top 4 at their first event. But then this team becomes one of the greatest in history because they win Code 5 and they smash Fnatic in the final. Fnatic was one of the best teams, in fact, it was the best team in 2007. Smash Fnatic in the final. They have like top 4s at a whole bunch of events. It gets towards further on in the year, ESWC Masters Paris. Single elim event, they smash Fnatic in the final again. 2 titles down already. ESWC, they lose to Fnatic this time. They don't make a deep run there. They actually bombed out of the group stage at an IEM event in LA. They only finished 4th in Dubai, but then WM comes along, which is like the Chinese event, which was put on by the people who formerly ran WEG, World Esports Masters, and had tons of top teams there. They win this event. They've won another title. They beat Mouseswats in the final in a really close game. They'd beaten Fnatic again. This year was the story of mTw, always beating Fnatic. And they used to just fuck Fnatic up. And part of it was they used to just always have the better tactical game with a better map pool when it played against it. And so Fnatic's like simple tactical style didn't work as well, and this overall approach, mTw were just the tactical masters behind Ave. You then come into, they had WCG that year, the last major of the year, and they win that. They win the gold medal at WCG where they'd failed to the year before, and they beat the Poles, then they beat in the round of 8, then they beat SK Gaming in the final. Then at DreamHack Winter, what would have been the perfect end to the year, they only finished 2nd here. And the reason why it's sick is because they'd been the best team all year. Then they had this amazing bracket where if they'd won, they almost won the event. They were literally a couple of rounds away, and yet they would have had like the sickest bracket run ever, where they beat Mouseswats, one of their main rivals over the year, one of the best teams of the year, beat them in the round of 8. Then they beat Fnatic in the semi-finals. Then in the final they played SK, but they lost the 3rd map, Nuke, in overtime. There was a very famous Zet clip where I think with a pistol he killed a whole bunch of people, and that denied them that victory. Then they won this small Russian tournament called Recruit at the end of the year, beating Virtus Pro, but another nice small title. 2009 began, and everyone thought, right, mTw is still on top because they won the IEM3 European Championship. They beat the Poles, mega big. They wrecked them on train, had a 15-0 half on CT. Then they beat Alternate. They won this title, so they'd won like 5 or 6 titles at this point in time. That's it, though. That's when they drop off. Because at that point onwards, the Fnatic new lineup takes over. The one that's got Googs, that's got Get Right, and goes to a mega skilled approach. And what's interesting is what made them different to the mTw approaches. mTw's slow setup to do the tactic would be interrupted by this aggressive aggro super skilled player, Fnatic, who would get in their face on the when Fnatic was on CT side and disrupt the flow of the T side. So they really knocked mTw off, and mTw actually knocked off to just being like a fourth or a third or fourth best team at this point in time. And as a result, they only finished third at the big IEM3 global major. And then towards the end of the year, after not many good placings in between, they finished bronze medal at WCG 2009 when they got a new lineup. Wimp and MG retired, and in came Trace and Minette. Finished third there. At the end of the year, they had another DreamHack winter run that was sick, where they had a stand-in Aniz this time, and they managed to make it all the way to the final. They beat SK, they beat Fnatic, and then they lost to MYM Sweden there, Delpan and Zet and those guys. And then they had Arbalec Cup Europe at the end of the year. We had Arcadian as a stand-in now, both stand-ins, by the way, instead of Sunder, who'd gone to South America. They finished second there with Arcadian as a stand-in, lost to SK Gaming this time in the final. In 2010, they get Sunder back, and the lineup initially is doing terribly. You're thinking they're really still going to be an elite level team. No, they do terribly. They don't even make the playoffs of IEM Europe or IEM World Championship, two of the really big events. But then they start to get their feet under them. They finish like top 3 at Arbalec Cup Europe. And what's interesting is they lose a best of 3 there to Na'Vi. And there's actually a story to be played behind this. The rivalry with Na'Vi, which is back at the European Championship, they'd gotten smashed by Na'Vi on train. They lose the semi-final here. They would go on, Na'Vi would be the greatest team this year and be very good for like a year and a half. And during that time, overall, the rivalry lasted like 17 months. It was a nightmare, 17 or 18 months. For mTw, it was a nightmare. Even though some games famously were close and people think of it as a close rivalry, actually Na'Vi just bodied them. They played, I think they played something like, what was it? I think they played like 19 maps, and mTw only won 3 of them, and they lost all 6 best of 3s they played against them. And as a result, it ruined the whole year, because they were the second best team for the whole of 2010, or right up there, second or third best, depending on which you want to argue between them and Fnatic. But it was always Na'Vi in their way beating them. So they managed to lose to them at Arbalec Cup Europe. Then at DreamHack Summer, they won the event. It's the one big event they won from the year, but that was because SK beat Na'Vi for them, and they beat SK in the final. No, in the semi-final, actually. They beat H2K in the final. At ESWC, they finished third, losing to Na'Vi again. Arbalec Cup Dallas, they only finished round of 8 because they lost to Na'Vi there. They finished second at WCG to Na'Vi in a famous overtime game. Then towards the end of the year, they had their own issues because at these 2 Danish events, KGC and DSRAC, they lost to Full Gaming, who were the second best team from Denmark, we all thought, but actually Arcadian and those guys, but actually were upsetting them. They had Friese in the lineup. And so they actually got Friese, they actually got Arcadian to come to their team. So he took over being the in-game leader, and Ave was just going to be a player from then on. So they finished second at DreamHack Winter, losing to Na'Vi again. Yeah, the biggest break was in 2011. Na'Vi got upset on the other side of the bracket. So in the final of IEM5 European Championship, they got to play Fnatic, and they were at match point on the second map train, and they lost the final, actually. They finished second. Then they had only a third place at IEM World Championship because they lost to Na'Vi again. Copenhagen Games, they lost an amazing series to the Poles, who they'd actually beaten at IEM European Championship in the semi-final. Another amazing series there, 2 great series. This time they lost it, they only finished top 4 there. DreamHack Summer, they finished second, losing to SK, who now became the dominant team for a couple of months. Eastar Seoul, they only finished top 4 there. IEM New York, they went there and they had to use a stand-in. I think it was Turkish, because someone couldn't attend the event. I forget who. Yeah, I forget who, possibly Sunder, I can't remember. The lineup pretty much disintegrated at that point in time. So for early 2012, though, zonic still wanted to play. So actually he went over to play with the German Mouse Sports team, because I think Carrigan was already over there, and he went over to play there. And obviously he can't speak German, can speak very little, and he was trying to play in that lineup, but he did really badly. They didn't make out the group at the IEM6 Kiev tournament. They didn't make out the group at IEM6 World Championship. And that was pretty much the end of 1.6. In CSGO, no real impact there, never made any big attempts to join a team. There was this rumour that mTw was going to try and reform and make a team, but that never went through because the investor pulled out. Now, as a player, what's interesting about his progression, the progression of Zonic's career, is that most of his success came in the latter part when he wasn't a star player. Originally, he had been known as a star player, a main carry, a really great fragger and an aimer, but as a result, he was in lesser teams, like 5th to 8th level European teams. Then when he took over more of like a middleman type role, and later just a role player playing like lurking type roles, then he allowed his other guys to be the stars, and he became an incredibly valuable player, super clutch player. So later on, his stars would be like HPX with the AWP, then Sunder as a rifler, and later AWPer, then Wimp as this sick team play, amazing aimer as well, and then Trace as this godlike, probably the most skilled Danish player ever, amazing player. So the key thing about zonic is he's one of the best lurker and clutch type players in history. The amount of clutch rounds this guy won were incredible. It's not that he had mad aim at that point in his career. He just really did have that sick quality where he had a really good sixth sense for where the enemy would be, where to position himself, would be intelligent with taking a positioning where he didn't have to hit a crazy headshot. He could just get the jump on someone, put some bullets in their chest with decent aim, get the kill, and he really had like ice water in his veins, and he could reset very well between kills to allow himself to do crazy 1v5s and 1v3s with amazing regularity. He's very, very good at that. And because of this quality, that's one of the reasons why mTw was able to play very well from behind and always be in a game when they were down numbers. Very good in that sense. As a result, he was a sick role player. He understood his role within some of the best, two of the best tactical teams of all time. 2008 mTw, 2010 mTw. Differences being like the Wimp era and the Trace era. Because what he did was he partnered with Ave, the in-game leader, to make this really good foundation. And with those players who always played within the tactical base, you always knew you had the basis. Yes, they had other players later, Wimp, and then later on you had Arcadian, who they could mix in there to make the foundation from and let the stars do what they want to do. But he was always there right with him. So he was a sick foundation for some of the best teams ever. So absolutely a very special player, especially because of the way he was able to transition throughout his career through these different roles and play with all these different players and find this massive amount of success. Even if aside from the 2008, early 2009, he didn't win many titles, he had many top fours, an incredible amount of top fours. That was the thing about his mTw teams. They were so consistent at placing top four, and they were very hard to beat and put away because of this like ability to be clutch, to come from behind, to play within the tactics, to grind opponents down. And they always had a good map pool as well as a result. It's unfortunate for them that they had this sick anti-rivalry with Na'Vi, where Na'Vi was always beating them. But then again, their great 2008 year came from having their own kryptonite dominance over Fnatic in many ways. So that's the cruelty and the gift that CS gives you when you're a great player and great teams. So zonic, one of the best players of all time.
Hi, this is Natu, a guy who's way too old and way too long involved in this game, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.